What's up, guys? 1-0 yesterday. I enjoy days like that on Sunday where I just have one play and it's the earliest game on the board, noontime. It just wins pretty easily, and then you're out of there. The under in the Marlins-Mets game hit. I was a little bit nervous about it because it was like 2-2 in the eighth, and I'm like, oh, man, if this goes into extra innings, you get the runner on second rule, and you could see like a barrage of runs. That stupid rule has to go away, man. It's just not even baseball anymore. It becomes more like an arcade game. And that is a ruiner of unders, but that under still got there. We move on to today. It's a shorter Monday baseball card, and I'm not going to have any official plays here. I'll give you like my two strongest leans here, and other than that, I don't love this card really. Sometimes I like the Monday card because you can focus more because there's less to be looking at, and you can find spots, but this one is a little bit difficult, and we still have 3 games where starting pitchers are undecided, so that makes the handicapping a little bit hard too, with Miami, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh Miami, Cincinnati, and Texas have all not decided on a pitcher yet, so they'll be doing that later in the day, I suppose. On Monday, of course, you're going to have a bunch of teams returning home from road trips, which I always say is a bad spot. It tends to be a distracted spot because you're coming off the road, you have to get back to home life, you have stuff to do. Grocery shopping, got to get your home affairs in order. It tends to be a bit of a distraction. So, of course, on Monday, there are teams in those return home spots. Miami is in one. Toronto, Kansas City, I believe, San Diego, and the LA Dodgers, I think, all qualify as far as that's concerned. Some of those road trips being longer than others. So those are teams that I wouldn't really want to be on. And speaking of San Diego, this game, my initial reaction was to want to play an under in this game because I'm looking at the starting pitching matchup. They're returning home from a road trip, like I said. So that could affect their hitting a little bit for one thing, but it's a really short road trip they're coming off of, so they're probably going to be less affected than some of these other teams. They just went to Colorado. They only had a one-series road trip, but it is still a situation where they had to go into elevation, and now they're coming back out of elevation. So it's not the easiest spot, and they lost 2 out of 3 there. And some bettors might think, well, San Diego's good. They're going to bounce back now that they're at home. I tend to kind of go the opposite way on that and think, well, they're going to be distracted a little bit, have to get back to home, like I said, even though it was a short road trip. And the fact that they're coming out of elevation, out of Colorado, and having to readjust to the different elevation, going back down to sea level, I don't think is that easy either. But then I look and I see Michael King is starting, and I'm like, I can't go against Michael King. I don't want to go against San Diego here. Really good numbers on the season, really high strikeout rate, just excellent numbers overall. ERA in the low 3s, whipping the 1-1s, and up against, who are they facing again? I can't even remember already. Up against Minnesota. Minnesota has seen him a bit, only 27 at bats worth, and he's held him to a 185 batting average and 489 OPS. So King has done really well against Minnesota. And then on the other side, Minnesota's throwing out Zebby Matthews, 24-year-old rookie who I talked about because I played him in his rookie debut and he pitched well. Got a win for me. Went 5 innings, only allowing 2 runs against Kansas City. 5 strikeouts, no walks, 5 hits allowed. Pretty good performance out of Matthews in his debut start there. So obviously I'm looking towards the under here once I see the starting pitching matchup. Seeing, King is a really good starting pitcher, and he has good numbers against Minnesota. Matthews looks like he's a really good young pitcher too, and San Diego has not seen him before, so Matthews is going to have the edge there. Facing a team that has not seen him, that tends to be an edge for that young pitcher that has good stuff. The hitters have to take some time to adjust to him and don't really hit him that well right out of the gate. And this is in Petco or whatever it's called now. I think it's still Petco. I don't know. In San Diego, which is a pitching-friendly park for sure. So a lot of things stacking up to want to play an under here. So that is the strongest play, I think, maybe on the entire board would be the under in Minnesota, San Diego. The problem is that Minnesota and San Diego both kind of used some of their bullpens yesterday. So the bullpen usage is a bit much for me to want to play this. Minnesota played into extra innings last night against Texas, or yesterday, I should say. Most of the games are afternoon games yesterday, except the night game, which both of those teams aren't playing today. Unfortunately, Yankees, Detroit winning in extra innings and celebrating on the field. I was like, man, at home, but I was like, man, Detroit, they're going to be in a letdown spot, especially if they have to play today. But unfortunately, they don't have to play today. They do play tomorrow, of course, and could be a team to go against there as well. But I'd probably be going against Detroit today, but they're not on the board, like I said. So Minnesota, yeah, they did play into extra innings yesterday, so they had to use more of their bullpen. San Diego used some of their bullpen. They used like 3 relief pitchers, I think, so not as much bullpen usage there. It just makes me hesitate a little bit on playing a full game under in this one. And the books know what they're doing. They're lining this at 7.5. So they're basically telling you what to think here. And it has already dropped from 7.5 juice to the over down to 7.5 juice to the under. So it does look like there has been some early movement moving it towards the under. So some agreement with my thinking here. I'm just not going to do it just because of the Minnesota bullpen situation, even though the extra inning play yesterday could also hurt Minnesota's offense as well. Like you could see some sluggish offenses in a spot like this coming into this game. So I agree with the under, but I don't think I quite want to do this one, even though I do like the starting pitching matchup. And I'd probably be on it if the bullpens were a little bit less taxed. I think I would do it. And Zebby Matthews, as I said the first time I talked about him when I played him and won, I have to just keep pushing all the wins that I have, man, against Kansas City. I talked about how he was just really good in the minors, too. He had an ERA in like the ones throughout the minors, except it went up to like 5 in AAA, but it was in a very small sample size. And his strikeout walk ratio was completely insane in the minors. Something to the tune of this year across single A, double A, and triple A, it was like 115-7 or something along those lines. And even in triple A, where he had the bad ERA, it was still like 21-1 or something like that. So he was still pitching really well there. So I do like Matthews. The other lean that I kind of have here is on the New York Mets, which it did look like there was some movement up on the Mets from -123 to -125, but it's gone back down to -123. This is a situation where Baltimore's got Trevor Rogers pitching. I'm going to push another one of my wins here because I went against him, I think, in his last outing, where he's a guy that Baltimore picked up right before the trade deadline from Miami, even though I don't think he's a very good pitcher. Hasn't been doing well this season on either team that he's been on. I just didn't really understand that. I mean, they needed a guy to fill a spot in the rotation, I guess, but he's not very good. And then weirdly, like 2 of his first 4 starts or something with Baltimore, he winds up having to face the NL East. So even though Baltimore's in the AL East, he winds up getting thrown into all these interleague games against his former division. So against hitters that are pretty familiar with him. So that's not a good situation for him either. And I went against him when that was the case when he played against Washington. I believe I won that game because Rogers was the worst pitcher and he was familiar to those hitters, didn't have very good numbers against them. That is the case here as well. Rogers is going up against another NL East team that's familiar with him, the Mets, and his numbers are, I would say, less than mediocre against the Mets. The Mets hit him in like the 270s, I think, something like that, with like a 770 or 780 OPS, if I recall. I'm not looking at it right now, but something along those lines. So his numbers are a little bit below average, I think, against the Mets hitters. So the Mets are familiar with him. They hit him okay. And on the other side, David Peterson is pitching. We have a battle of lefties. He's pitching for the Mets. He, of course, has the way better numbers on the season. Better ERA by like 2 runs, 3-something ERA, whereas Rogers is like in the 5s. The whips are both kind of bad, though. Rogers' whip, I mean, is really high, but Peterson's is also quite high in the 1.3s, which is why I don't really want to play on Peterson here because I don't think he's as good as his ERA looks. His whip, he's just putting a lot of men on base. He's walking too many guys. It's not great. Really, his ERA, I think, is kind of a mirage. Like, you can't keep getting away with putting that many men on base that consistently, I don't think. He does, however, have good numbers against Baltimore. I think it's in a limited sample size, but he's held them to some really low average. I could look at it. So I do still lean to the Mets here. Just because Rogers is so bad, I do still think that Peterson is actually the better of the 2 pitchers. Yeah, Baltimore in a sample size of 21 at bats, they're only 3 for 21 off him. He's held them to a 143 average and 470 OPS. So Peterson does have good numbers against Baltimore. So I like that too. So the pitching matchup looks pretty good for the Mets. And I think the situation is actually pretty good for the Mets as they're coming off a bad game yesterday against the Miami Marlins. Another win of mine, the under that I mentioned at the start of the show. Got the under in that when the Marlins beat them. And that's kind of embarrassing if you're the Mets, man. You're going to lose the final game of that homestand, or the final, not the homestand because they're still at home today, but the final game of that home series, I should say, against a really bad Marlins team. The Mets could be in a bounce back spot after that. It was just an ugly loss against a bad team, really. And the Mets only used 3 of their relief pitchers in that game, even though it was a close, low-scoring game. So I don't think their bullpen is really at a huge disadvantage there. So they should be in a bounce-back spot coming off a bad loss, whereas the Baltimore Orioles are coming off a tough series at home against the Red Sox, where they bookended it with 2 wins against my Red Sox. Baltimore won game 1, lost the 2 middle games, and then won the last game. So now they're coming off a win against the Red Sox, a big win where Baltimore won that game and then watched the Yankees lose on that walk-off against Detroit in the ESPN night game. And Baltimore leapt back into first place, leapfrogged the Yankees back into first place. They have the same record, but Baltimore is the first place team right now with the tiebreakers and whatever. So Baltimore could be in a bit of a letdown after that, coming off a big division series, getting back in first place over the Yankees. They also only used 3 relief pitchers yesterday, but I still think that they could be in a letdown spot coming into this, whereas the Mets are in more of a bounce back spot here after that loss to Miami. So those are kind of the 2 strongest leans I would say I have on the board there. I was kind of looking at going against the Dodgers too, just because Gavin Stone, I think, is the worst of the 2 pitchers between him and Brian Wu. And Dodgers are returning home from, I think, a pretty extended road trip. So it's not a great spot for the Dodgers, and they don't have one of their best pitchers on the mound. But Stone, I think, has very limited sample size against Seattle, and I think he's actually not done that well against them. But I think Wu, also in a very small sample size, has done badly against the Dodgers, even though I think it's only like 5 at bats. I think they're like 3 for 5 off him, or 4 for 5. Ohtani doing most of that damage, of course, because Ohtani was on Anaheim, I think, last year, right? So Seattle faced him a bit. Wu, I think, still is the better pitcher there. He's been putting up some really good starts recently. Wu has really not been allowing much of anything, even though he's not that much of a strikeout guy. Really low ERA, really low whip. So I do still lean to Seattle in that one too, slightly. And I think that's it, basically. I was going to just kind of comment and laugh on the way the Yankees-Tigers game ended last night with the Tigers on that walk-off. It was on a single into left field, and they scored a run from second, I'm pretty sure. But the left fielder, I believe, was the Yankees' top prospect or whatever, like young rookie prospect. They brought him up. It was his major league debut. Dominguez, I think is his name. And he did not have a good game, man. He was 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts. And then on the final play there, he didn't juggle the ball, but he kind of like hesitated on the throw. And I think if he hadn't hesitated, maybe he had a shot to throw the runner out at home. Maybe not. Maybe he still would have scored, but that hesitation wasn't good, man. It basically ensured that Detroit was going to score. He hesitated, then he threw it down to home, and Detroit scored and won the game. Not a good debut. I don't think he's going to be a bad player, but not a great way to enter the majors there. And I just laugh as a non-fan of the Yankees, let's say. Have a good Monday, man. Have a good week. No official plays for me, but hopefully some of that info was useful. Peace.